I have a series on this channel occasionally where I take a look at some of the bigger, more interesting fads from the past, fidget spinners in the 2010s or Beanie Babies in the 1990s. It is so fascinating to see something almost defy logic by quickly becoming one of the most desired, talked about items on the planet, and then usually only within a few years diminish in popularity so much to where most people don't really care about it anymore. Well, going back to the 1980s, probably the biggest fad of the decade was the Rubik's Cube. I mean, this thing is practically become a symbol to represent that decade, right? If you watch a show like VH1's I Love the 80s or a movie set in the 1980s like The Wedding Singer, there is a fair chance that you will see a Rubik's Cube somewhere. And I want to be perfectly clear that I do not mean to disrespect the Rubik's Cube by calling it a fad. It has continuously been produced and sold in stores all over the place, continues to have a dedicated following, and has even experienced an ongoing resurgence for over 20 years now that I will highlight, but realistically, none of that compares to how much of a phenomenon it became in the 1980s. So in this video, I'm excited to bring back my fad series by talking all about the Rubik's Cube. The product is named after its inventor, Erno Rubik, who I have to respect for creating something so unique and appealing that it briefly captured everyone's attention. In 1974, he was a 29-year-old professor teaching a 3D geometry class at a university in Budapest, Hungary. In his free time, he would build models of shapes and wooden blocks, things like that, and the famous cube was invented almost as an accident as part of that hobby. He had a bunch of those blocks that he had made lying around his room, took a look at them, and decided to experiment by sticking a bunch of them together into a bigger cube in a way that they could twist around. He failed to realize that he had created a puzzle until he made each face a different color so he could track where they went. That first one was 2x2, soon followed by a wooden 3x3. Initially, he was unsure if that one was even solvable, but after about a month of working at it, he was able to figure it out. He described that moment as a great sense of accomplishment and utter relief, likely because it not only proved that it was possible, but that it may have commercial potential. Shortly after, he applied for a patent in Hungary, worked with a local company to have it manufactured, and by the end of the 1970s, it was a best-selling toy in his home country. From there, the head of a company in London called Seven Towns saw the cube at a toy fair and ultimately got involved by making contracts with foreign toy makers to sell the product on a global scale. Most notably, it was the deal they made with Ideal Toy Company, one of the largest in the United States at the time. They specialized in making dolls, but were most famously known as the originators of the teddy bear in the early 1900s. Through Ideal, the Rubik's Cube hit store shelves in the United States in 1980, and over the next couple of years, it became potentially the most sought-after toy on the market. I think that a lot of the appeal comes from the fact that it looks kind of easy to solve, right? Maybe it's just me, but I look at it and I think, yeah, I could probably figure that out, but as soon as I start making a few turns, it starts to feel impossible. So then people started asking their friends for help, spreading the word about it and getting them hooked on it, or looking up strategies on how to do it. It is hard to do on your own, because remember, even Rubik himself had to spend a month on it without instruction. Well, in the 1980s, getting instructions usually meant finding a book on the subject, which explains why some of the best-selling books in the US at the time were about solving the Rubik's Cube. I'm talking about millions of copies sold by different authors capitalizing on this craze. It became a big mystery that everybody wanted to solve, and if you were one of the people that could solve it, you seemed like an absolute genius. Of course, there are algorithms and strategies involved in solving it to where you don't really need to be a genius, but to this day, it is like a go-to way to show that a movie or TV character is smart. And then, once people learned how to solve it, they started trying to become more efficient at solving it as fast as possible. It has since become known as speed cubing. In 1982, there was an official contest to see who could do it the fastest, where the winning time was an impressive 22.95 seconds. I could not even imagine being able to solve it in that amount of time. Erno Rubik believes that the appeal of the cube comes more from the artistic side of it, saying people like its beauty, simplicity, and form. It's really not a puzzle or a toy, it is a piece of art. Plus, consider the fact that its demographic has no limits. People of any age from any culture can find it appealing. Shortly after introducing it to the US market in 1980, Ideal started an aggressive advertising campaign involving both television television and newspapers, with ads that I would say effectively promoted most of the different reasons it was attractive, highlighting the beauty of it, the difficulty, and the addictive nature by using the tagline,
Rubik's Cube, over 3 billion combinations, but just one solution from Ideal.
Trust me, we're all going to be better off if I don't even attempt to dig into the math here, but actual mathematicians have calculated that there are in fact over 43 quintillion combinations. That is a number that is so high that I was not even sure it existed until this moment. Within the span of only 3 years, it is estimated that 100 million Rubik's Cubes were sold throughout the world. It has been reported that Erno had previously been making $800 a month as a professor, and at the height of the fad, he was making $30,000 a month in royalties. Even though the Rubik's Cube is now used to represent the entirety of the 1980s, you may be surprised to learn that the reality of it is that the fad was already dying down as early as 1982. In October of that year, the New York Times published an article titled Rubik's Cube, A Craze Ends, and in that article, they quote the VP of merchandising for the company saying, "It's obvious that the cube volume itself is not where it was last year. The cube is still selling, but it was a phenomenon last year." And Charles Lazarus from Toys R Us said, "It's an okay item, not as hot as last year." From that point, the Rubik's Cube continued to decline as it moved around under the control of different companies, and by the 1990s, it was almost forgotten. Still available in stores and mentioned every once in a while, but nowhere near the same level. It would usually be when someone was cleaning out an old box from the attic or something like that. In 1986, I think it's telling that the New York Times published a different article that started by saying there might be someone somewhere who is still agonizing over Rubik's Cube, but for the most part, that frustrating artifact of the early 1980s has been retired to the attic, the garbage heap, and with a bow to its elegance and ingeniousness, to the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Arts. Basically saying that even though its popularity had fizzled out, there was still a lot to respect about it. Now, the big question here is, why did it decline so drastically? What happened to the Rubik's Cube? And to answer that, I would simply say that people got tired of it. After all this time talking about it, I still don't think I have effectively conveyed how popular it was. It was on the cover of magazines, it was being given awards, there was a cartoon on the air called Rubik, the Amazing Cube, and Erno Rubik became way more famous than he ever wanted to be. Those 100 million units sold that I mentioned earlier is in fact a ridiculous amount, but still doesn't tell the full story. It has been estimated that an additional 50 million knockoff cubes were being sold during that time. Most of them were lower quality for a considerably lower price. Ideal was out there filing lawsuits against the makers of these knockoff cubes and against the retailers that were selling them. I guess there was no patent in the US preventing it, but then they were being packaged and advertised in ways that Ideal felt was deceiving the customers into believing that they were official Rubik's brand. For example, they sued the retailer Macy's because they were selling cubes without any name on them next to a TV that was showing commercials for the Rubik's Cube. Plus, in addition to all of this, there were new similar products being introduced by Ideal during that time, also trying to capitalize on their own craze. There were tiny keychain cubes and giant cubes, any kind you could think of. It was hard for anyone to live their life for very long without encountering a colorful cube somewhere. It was too much, and you can't possibly expect something to maintain that level of popularity for more than a couple of years anyway. It's hard for something that burns so bright to burn for very long. So, as most people predicted, the Rubik's Cube quickly faded away in most people's minds until the early 2000s. As I hinted at before, there has been a respectable resurgence that was likely sparked by the World Cube Association. It is an organization started in 2004 that holds thousands of puzzle-solving competitions. Then YouTube came out, helping to push it to the next level. It became the new popular way to learn how to solve it, more accessible and easier to follow than the books from the past. Seriously, right now, there are instructional videos on how to solve it on YouTube with tens of millions of views. Then the recession happened, seemingly taking the Rubik's Cube to yet another level. A lot of people were having a hard time financially without much money to spend on toys, so they were drawn to the more comforting, nostalgic, reliable, inexpensive toys like the Rubik's Cube. In 2009, when sales for the Rubik's Cube were considerably higher than they had been in previous years, it was big news when they introduced even more new puzzles like the interactive Touch Cube and the spherical Rubik's 360, keeping the brand fresh. Then in 2014, the Rubik's Cube was inducted into the US National Toy Hall of Fame, one of the highest honors for a toy. Today, there is a sizable community of cubers who dedicate a lot of effort into solving these puzzles in faster and more efficient ways. It's pretty wild that I was impressed by someone in that original competition in the 1980s being able to solve it in less than 23 seconds, while today, the world record has been reduced all the way down to 3.13 seconds. That is for humans, obviously. If you're talking about robots, Mitsubishi made one that has solved it in 0.305 seconds. Though, somewhat ironically, most of these cubers now prefer to use the knockoffs. They usually tend to come from China. They are easier to turn with less friction, so the imitators are still a large threat to the company. In 2021, Rubik's was acquired by a Canadian company called Spin Master, who was already the producer of multiple children's toys, including Etch-a-Sketch and Hatchimals. The price they paid for it was $50 million, to which I would say a valuation like that is impressive for a product that could have potentially been deemed a short-lived failure many decades earlier. In fact, 2024 marks the 50th anniversary of the invention of the Rubik's Cube, so I felt it was an appropriate time to take a look back at how it became so popular, how it died down, and where it stands today. Let me know in the comments, have you ever been able to solve one of these Rubik's Cubes, and how did you do it? Did you use instructions from a website, a YouTube video, a friend, maybe a book? Did you do it on your own? I am still impressed when I see somebody that can do it, so I look forward to hearing about that. Oh, and I'm really curious to learn, is there anybody watching this that remembers when the fad was at its peak in the early 1980s? I want to know what that was like. Did you buy one? Did you buy a knockoff one thinking it was the real one, or just because it was cheaper? Did you learn how to solve it? Did you get tired of seeing them everywhere, or maybe you never got caught up in the craze? I want to hear about your experience, and any other thoughts you have about the Rubik's Cube, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.